Thank you.
Can I ask a question of my own to start the ball rolling, which is really about the proposed bonfire of EU regulations, which is in the Brexit benefits report and the kind of things that Jacob Rees-Mogg says. On the one hand, people think this must be a good thing because there will be less, quote, red tape, unquote. On the other hand, people hate adapting to change, and particularly to change which puts us out of sync with what's going on in the rest of Europe. Can you talk to us a little bit about this proposed bonfire of EU regulations?
Well, so far we don't seem to have got very far at all. And I do remember working for the government where a number of times we tried to look at how we can reduce the costs of complying with EU regulations while we were in the EU, and finding it very hard to pinpoint the areas where we could get serious benefits from reducing those regulations. Now, there are a few in the financial sector that one can do. As we know, the sort of MiFID thing, it's all to do with the insurance sector, and where the regulations that allow or do not allow pension funds, insurance companies to invest in long-term assets like infrastructure assets, so they can finance that. So we could change a few things there. But we had huge sort of liberals before. I mean, we could do all sorts of things with VAT, frankly. And we were not really constrained by very many things. I mean, there are some on intellectual property and so on, but they're not going to have any serious impact on the economy. And that's the issue, unless we decide to also do something about labor laws and suddenly, there are some in terms of, how you list in the stock exchange we could do, which the Europeans may not want to do. But you've got to be very careful in terms of relaxing rules in terms of worker conditions, standards, or anything like that, because the EU will retaliate. And one of the reasons why the worry is that the problems in Northern Ireland might lead to higher inflation is because Europe is perfectly entitled to then impose tariffs on the goods we buy from them, and impose tariffs on the goods we sell to them, and then we basically start a trade war, which would also mean imposing possibly tariffs on the goods they sell to us, plus of course constraining some of the exports that they provide to us. So I don't think there is a huge amount of scope to cut regulations, frankly, but it sounds good. It sounds good, but
good, but it doesn't sound so good to many of the industrialists, does it, who receive these sermons? Can I kind of go back to a picture whereby in the old days, when I learned my economics and read my newspapers, the great discipline on a government was the market. And in the years of fixed exchange rates, the UK was always very vulnerable to changes in the balance of payments, changes in the value of sterling, and changes in the reserves. So those were the things which kind of kept politicians and chancellors, quote, honest, unquote. What are the disciplines on a government today?
Well, we don't have fixed exchange rates, so the exchange rates go up and down, the way the market feels the currencies should move. I mean, there isn't any, the Monetary Policy Committee or the Bank of England has no remit to keep the exchange rate high, but of course they have a remit in terms of inflation. So what we've seen is that despite the fact we've raised interest rates, the currency is quite weak right now against the US dollar, of course. So, and it does add to inflation, as I suggested earlier, because this is what happened after the vote to leave the EU. The exchange rate dropped. And in fact, we didn't raise interest rates to sustain the currency. In fact, we lowered interest rates, and the way the markets adjust your exchange rate is mostly, yes, of course, interest rate differentials matter at the margin, but it's mostly on assumptions of what is going to happen to your growth in the future. And if you think your growth's been downgraded as a result of leaving the EU, which is exactly what they thought, and they're downgrading it now because we have all these extra problems, including Brexit, and supply chain constraints and all that, then they will downgrade your currency as well. And no increase of interest rates is going to really make any huge difference. And we no longer worry particularly about balance of payments. It is true that because we're importing quite a lot less, our balance of trade with the EU has improved, but that is nothing really to get very excited about, because we do need their imports, as we know, in this sort of globalized environment. I was asked something also in your, give me a second. For what I was going, can I just quickly answer some of the chat ones that are there already, sort of very quickly, just on quantitative easing. Is that okay, or would you like,
yeah, sure.
me to do that?
Perfect.
I think Ian asked a question about Adam Posen. So the reasons he gives are the tightness of the market, and that's why we have higher inflation or part of the inflation in the UK is caused because of that. And also because, of course, you have to pass some of those costs. And also because of more supply chain, the trade restrictions that exist, more supply chain issues here than other countries in Europe are having. So he's comparing us with elsewhere in Europe. So those are the reasons. And in terms of quantitative easing, it's interesting, the question, absolutely right. Does it have to be paid back? I mean, quantitative easing is basically acquiring bonds in the secondary market and then putting them in your balance sheets, if you like, while you're allowing a lot of liquidity there. What happens is that the bonds you've acquired mature at some point. They're government bonds. The average maturity is 15 years, but there are loads of shorter maturity bonds you've bought in the market. And what you can do is you can just, let them mature, and that's it. They basically come out of your balance sheet, if you like, or you can replace them. So you can buy more and replenish your balance sheet, or you can start selling those bonds directly yourself before they mature, and that is called quantitative tightening. Because what you're doing, you are taking money out of the system. So when you're selling those bonds, someone's going to buy them. So that money you take and keep. When you're buying them, you pay them the money. So you inject liquidity into the market. That's how the system works. So the real question is, do you have to pay back government debt? Well, the answer is no, really.
All right, I think we better move on to Vera Lustig's question, which is after Ian's on the chat, if you can see it, which is how much has the hardness of Brexit affected our economy? And would the effects have been less severe if we'd stayed in the single market and the customs union?
Yes, there have been quite a lot of calculations on what's happened already. So the Centre for European Reform has done a lot of work suggesting that we have already lost possibly something like 3% of GDP than would otherwise be the case. And it's interesting that the Office of Budget Responsibility, which is the government body, if you want to call it that, supposedly independent, but in fact reports to the Treasury, which comes out with all its forecasts, has calculated that the fall overall of GDP, which is not going to be recovered, is about 4%. So in other words, we have permanently lost, or we're permanently going to be losing, because not all of it has happened yet, some 4% of our GDP. Which of course means that by comparison to the other countries in Europe, they have had a bit of a fall in GDP because we've left and there was a lot of interconnectivity, but it is very, very small. We're all going to have a scarring from COVID, but in addition, we will also have this 4% scarring from Brexit.
Would you say that was accepted by the government?
Well, the interesting thing is that they keep repeating it. So the latest publication they put out with the budget still said the same, that they have not changed their view that it's going to be affecting GDP by something like 4%, minus 4%, because of Brexit. And they have it, of course, in their forecasts. So the government has to accept it, because all the financial forecasts or the budget data that we see for the following years, and tax revenues, for example, they're all dependent on the type of growth which the economy is going to have. And that growth forecasts on which all those fiscal figures are based come from that organization, the Office of Budget Responsibility. So they may not like it, but they're basing a lot of their actions on it.
Nevertheless, we have a question here from Robert Franceschini, the chairman of the Devon branch of the European Movement, who, in his view, he says Brexit isn't mentioned or discussed by politicians or by the BBC. And why is this? He doesn't think the debate is actually happening. And if I guess he is implying that the BBC is a little bit muzzled, and that the reason Nadine Dorries is so keen on doing something with Channel 4 is because they don't feel muzzled.
Well, that may indeed be true, but I think it's absolutely right that we don't see much of a debate, but there is quite a lot of mention. So you haven't seen the types of debates that we had before, but frankly, they were terrible, because, you know, on one side you have all these economists saying various things which were pro staying in the EU, and then you had, you know, one person with a different view saying no, no, no. And so it was never a proper debate. So you don't have that debate, but you do have a lot of mention, concerns about the impact of Brexit on this. But as I said, there are periods when Partygate sort of takes over, or, you know, whatever happened today, or the war. So we had nothing but the war for ages on the BBC. And indeed, you have to go to other channels outside the BBC to see that debate actually happening.
One of the problems, and it was pointed out today or yesterday maybe by Vince Cable, is what he called the Remainers' vow of silence. And he talks about maybe this could be broken, following the example of the French President Macron, who offered a way of reopening the conversation he offered what I think is called associate status to Ukraine. And Vince Cable says, well, if he offers associate status to the Ukraine, maybe under the variable geometry kind of approach, that could also be offered to the United Kingdom. Do you think that's a possibility?
In fact, my understanding of what Macron said is that there would be another union of sorts, which would include some of the countries of the periphery, if you like, which would include the UK. So the offer, or at least his idea, was of a group of countries with the UK in it as well. So it wasn't just, you know, the Ukraine as associate status and others. But of course, that would be quite similar to, you know, being Norway, possibly. Which is, I think, what the Remainers would like to see as at least one step for going back in, to be like Norway. But the likelihood of any of these countries accepting us right now as part of any grouping, or at least before Boris Johnson was considered suddenly to be a hero in the Ukraine, the likelihood wasn't very great that they would accept us with open arms. But maybe the climate has changed.
Maybe times will change, but I can't see us becoming a rule taker very quickly. Vicky, can I ask you a personal question? Which is, you've been an economist both in government and in the private sector. And I'd be grateful if you could compare for us your experiences, and particularly, you know, talking about this whole issue of the debate of Brexit and the issues, about the constraints you experienced in government on your freedom to express your views, get them to ministers and to the wider public. Are you handcuffed in government?
Oh, in terms of what civil servants say, of course, you have to be very careful because there is a certain policy that the government has decided on. But it does not mean that you are hiding in any way the evidence you produce, which sometimes gets ignored by the government. So, for example, when I was in charge of economics at BIS, BIS, whatever it is called these days, the business department, we would produce all these reports which would be on the website, so everyone could see what we were saying, like trade's a good thing, for example, and we shouldn't stop trade finance and all that sort of stuff, and export help that we were giving. There are times when your advice and the evidence you provide is ignored. But the important thing about civil servants and government, the way it works, is that there are all sorts of procedures you have to go through when a government department decides to go and spend some money, which you've got to really justify with the Public Accounts Committee and later with the National Audit Office. So a department can't just do what everyone and it is checked. What is checked in all those cases is, what did the evidence say? What was the advice by the analysts and the policymakers, and what evidence did they have when they made that advice to spend that money, and was there value for money in a particular decision? So, and the important thing is to be able to produce that, so that because the head of the department will be in real trouble if we've spent money without doing the proper calculation. So if you were putting an advice to the government which you knew was right and they don't like it for political reasons, you often have to get something called direction. So even I got direction from one of my Secretary of State. In other words, a direction that says, I hear what you're saying, you don't think it's value for money, or you think we should be doing something different. My decision is to ignore your advice. I have to give you direction. Those directions are documented. So there is actually quite a lot of transparency in terms of what, for example, as we know, the Rwanda case, what we hear is that the permanent secretary needed to get a direction from Priti Patel to override the department's advice that this wasn't good value for money, doing what they suggested doing in terms of exporting people to Rwanda. And there was direction. We all knew that this was, or at least it was documented, if anyone wanted to go and have a look. So there is actually quite a lot of transparency. So we were certainly able to say to our ministers exactly what we thought. So I was able to say.
Yeah, that's a very specific case. And I agree, this whole value for money thing usually comes up in terms of great specifics. I cannot see a civil servant saying Brexit is not value for money.
Of course they did. I'm sure they did. I'm sure there's a lot of evidence around that
They
came up with that.
The ministers, but did they say it to the public?
Well, if you look at even the OBR's work at the time, they were themselves showing all sorts of data which were suggesting that, for example, not having people from Europe in the numbers that we had before, or having migration reduced, would be bad for productivity, bad for the economy. And that was coming out and for growth. So that was coming out pretty strongly. And then there was a series of reports by different departments on the impact of Brexit, which also showed very clearly that it would be a negative action to take to leave the EU. So all that evidence is out there, produced by government departments. So there is a lot of transparency. Now, the politicians, of course, can ignore it. They may not believe it, but they have to say, did you remember, in fact, David Davis in Parliament or in one of the committees that when he was being quizzed, when it was pointed out to him that all these government departments had put out the information and data which were suggesting that Brexit would be negative for growth and negative for the departments, he said, I don't believe it, I never read what economists say anyway, or something like that. So it was clear that this information existed. So you've got to bear in mind that a lot of that evidence is provided. People are not shying away from saying what they believe. And that has been the general civil service ethos, which is pretty good news. But of course, it just tends to get ignored. And obviously, you still need pretty strong civil servants to continue to say that once they've been already told you know, just go away or something.
Yeah, they have to be very careful. I was very surprised to see in one of the Annan Nennan UK and Changing Europe Zooms the other day that not only was Catherine Barnard there and Eva Rogers, but also two civil servants, one from the EU, a lady, and one from the British Cabinet Office, a man called Olaf Henriksen Brown or something like that. And I thought that was extremely refreshing to see an actual civil servant, as you once were, on the airwaves.
Yes, and in fact, we did a lot of public appearances. But of course, you have a line to take as a civil servant, which is almost like a minister. You go with your line to take. So, or your lines to take, always.
Okay. I don't know about you, but I find this discussion about the transparency around the debate, particularly as somebody has commented in chat here, when the political parties actually don't want to engage. The Labour Party, you know, doesn't want to talk about it. They're worried, they're frightened.
Well, they are, sorry, I may have another 5 minutes or so, if that's okay.
Okay.
What my view is that they're worried that they will then give Boris Johnson something to hit them with. So, and that will be, you know, constantly, oh, this is a party that wants it, etc. So I think they're biding their time, probably, would be my view. So I see some of the comments about Labour being so wrong on Brexit and so on. So yes, I understand the frustration. I think we all feel it, who think that it was all a very big mistake. But the interesting thing about the economics is that it's sort of beginning to happen and happen a bit more. So as I mentioned, the Adam Posen stuff, the LSE studies, everything that Alain Menon and his group do, all the things we sort of all participate in, it's all coming out into the open a lot more, and not necessarily disputed. So I haven't seen a lot of comments on Adam Posen's thing saying no, it's not. And it was in a big conference where he was presenting this. So it's, I think it's still in the air and it is waiting to be picked up, really.
Okay, very good. Can we end up perhaps with a short discussion on the public finances and on the differences between the Chancellor and the Prime Minister? On the public finances, how strapped are we, or is the government simply saving itself up for a kind of giveaway before the next election?
Well, the problem is that it can't wait for very long. I mean, obviously the Chancellor is right now waiting a little bit to see what's going to happen in the future in terms of energy prices and everything else, but he would be quite worried if he suddenly did a lot and it wasn't needed, because he'll be told off by his hardliners, if you like, because you're wasting money, we want to be prudent. And if he does a little bit now and it isn't enough and he has to come back again, then he'll have to, you know, once again, he hasn't won anything because he hasn't done enough. So he's in this very, very difficult position that if he does too little, it's a problem. If he does too much, it's a problem. So his inclination will be to wait and offer something in the future, as you suggest. But I think the pressures are very great right now. I think this is, you know, the number of programs I've participated in just today on the cost of living issue and what can the Chancellor do. it's extraordinary. It's the main issue. And it's going to be that for a while, given the latest inflation data, and it's going to get possibly worse temporarily. So I'm suspecting he's going to have to do something. He can easily borrow. It's not a problem. As we discussed earlier, there's plenty of money still around, and the UK is perceived to be quite a safe country. So I think he's probably going to do that, but he might, in the short term, do things that don't cost him anything, like the windfall profits tax. I mean, it's painless. The company said that we're not going to reduce investment anyway, even if we get taxed. So he can do that without having to borrow. It's an easy one, so he can be seen to care and transfer all that to needy families without any real cost to him. He keeps referring to the minimum wage going up, but of course he doesn't have to pay it, except bits of the public sector, I suppose, who have to pay that. So there's a series of things that can be done which are not very expensive, but I can't see how you can avoid doing something on the benefit front.
Okay, a final question from me, which is kind of related, is where do you see interest rates going?
I think they'll double from where they are, but that would be it. But that would mean 2%, and then they'll come down. If you look at any forecast for the future, I'm afraid, okay, we may be very, very wrong. And of course, who knows what's going to happen with Russia. But whether it's the International Monetary Fund, whether it's any US or anyone else, they have inflation coming down to target at some point in the future. I think it will come to target faster because of the slow growth in the economy than any increase in interest rates. But just to keep their credibility going, they'll have to raise rates again.
Vicky, thank you for your great clarity and forthright replies. And I'm going to hand back to Ian.
Thank you.
I would echo what Peter said. That was very interesting. We, of course, tend to focus on the political side, but you've revealed some very interesting stuff, particularly about the relationship between civil servants and what is required and how the politicians respond to that. That's very interesting to me. And I'm interested that you think it may get worse and become more obvious what's going on. So that's been great. So thank you very much for going over time a bit. We're very grateful, and thank you for your words.
Not at all. Thank you very much, and thank you for having me again, and also for publicizing my various books, which is wonderful.